It was supposed to be an ordinary diplomatic visit. A U.S. congressional delegation led by Senator James Austin Scott touched down in Burkina Faso on August 29th. Cameras rolled, smiles flashed, and words of praise flowed like honey. They applauded the nation's booming agriculture, the reclaimed territories from years of terrorist violence, and the renewed energy of its economy. It all seemed routine, almost cordial, until something unusual happened. The leader they most wanted to see was not there. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young transitional president of Burkina Faso, chose silence over ceremony. He did not extend his hand, did not stand for photos, and did not sit for negotiations. Instead, he allowed his transitional parliament, led by Dr. Osman Bouma, to host the Americans. That decision shocked observers across Africa and the West. Why would a head of state refuse to meet when Washington had just showered his country with compliments? Why choose absence when presence seemed so safe? For many in Africa, the answer was obvious because silence can be louder than speeches. Traoré's refusal was not weakness. It was a calculated move, a message written in absence. In the world of diplomacy, every gesture is a signal. And here the signal was clear: Burkina Faso will not be flattered into submission. But what does this mean for Africa's sovereignty? Was this an act of wisdom shielding his nation from hidden deals, or a lost opportunity for cooperation with one of the world's most powerful countries? That is the question we will explore together. If you believe that leadership is measured not by handshakes, but by courage, then stay with us until the end. Please share this video if you feel proud to see Africa standing tall. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe that truth and dignity matter more than political theater. On the morning of August 29th, the people of Burkina Faso woke to news that a U.S. congressional delegation had landed in Ouagadougou. It was no small affair. The delegation was led by Senator James Austin Scott, a figure familiar with U.S. agricultural policy and international relations. Their mission, at least on the surface, was one of goodwill. They praised Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution, calling it nothing less than the breadbasket of the Sahel. They applauded the reclaiming of vast territories once under the grip of terrorist groups. They admired the sense of renewal, the dynamism of an economy that many in the West had long written off. For Burkina Faso, these words carried a strange weight. Only a short time ago, those very same voices in Washington had condemned the country's leadership. They accused Captain Ibrahim Traoré of being a dictator, of exploiting national resources for personal gain, of militarizing children, of trampling on human rights. Now, suddenly, the script had changed. Overnight criticism had turned to applause. The shift was not lost on the people. How they wondered, could the same leaders who once called Traoré dangerous now celebrate the fruits of his policies? The delegation met with Dr. Osman Bouma, president of the transitional parliament. Bouma welcomed them, formally spoke of cooperation, and listened to their proposals about agricultural support, economic partnerships, and security cooperation. Cameras captured the handshakes and speeches, and to the casual eye, it looked like diplomacy at work. But the absence of one man loomed larger than all the photographs taken that day. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not appear, not once. His chair at the table remained empty. And it was this absence that became the story. Observers quickly began to speculate: was it a scheduling conflict? Was the captain avoiding confrontation? Or was this deliberate, a signal crafted with precision? Those who have followed Traoré closely understood. From the very start of his leadership, he had spoken of sovereignty above all else. He expelled foreign military bases, rejected international interference, and insisted that Africa must chart its own course. To meet the Americans in this moment would have meant opening a door that could easily lead back to the same pressures and conditions that Africa has endured for decades. By remaining absent, he avoided both confrontation and compromise. The delegation's compliments were not empty. Burkina Faso's farmers are indeed producing more food than ever before. Tractors and equipment purchased under Traoré's policies have transformed dusty fields into productive farmland. Families who once depended on imported grain are now feeding themselves and their neighbors. Terrorist groups once emboldened are losing territory. There is progress on the ground visible to anyone who cares to look, but Traoré's silence forced the world to ask what price comes attached to American praise. For many Africans, the pattern is all too familiar. Praise often precedes pressure. Aid comes with conditions. Military cooperation is tied to political concessions. And handshakes are often followed by contracts that strip nations of their resources. By not attending, Traoré made a clear statement Burkina Faso would continue its diplomatic engagement, but on its own terms. He allowed his parliament to handle the visit, preserving the nation's dignity while keeping himself untouchable. It was in many ways a chess move, a reminder that in global politics, sometimes the strongest word is silence. For the United States, the absence was painful. They had traveled across an ocean to build bridges, only to find the man they most wanted to meet was not waiting on the other side. For the people of Burkina Faso, however, it was a moment of pride. Their leader had not bowed, had not been flattered into submission. Instead, he held firm to the principle that sovereignty cannot be traded for compliments. The event set the stage for deeper questions. Was this the beginning of a new era of equal partnerships, or the continuation of Africa's long struggle to resist foreign pressure? Only time will tell. But on that August day, the message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would not be defined by applause from abroad. The true climax of this story came not from what was said, but from what was left unsaid. For days, the headlines in Washington, Paris, and even Lagos carried the same question. Why did Captain Ibrahim Traoré refuse to meet the Americans? In diplomatic circles, absence is never accidental. Every handshake, every step onto a red carpet, every moment of eye contact is carefully choreographed. So when the most powerful country in the world sends a delegation and the host leader chooses silence, the signal is thunderous. For the Americans, the snub was painful. Senator James Austin Scott had flown thousands of miles with his colleagues, prepared to showcase goodwill. They praised the farmers, celebrated reclaimed land, and spoke of partnership. Yet the young captain they came to see remained in the shadows. To Washington insiders, this looked like defiance, a challenge to American prestige. To many Africans, it looked like wisdom. The emotional peak of the event was not in the Parliament Hall where Dr. Osman Bouma exchanged formalities. It was in the collective realization that Traoré had outmaneuvered seasoned politicians with nothing more than silence. His absence was louder than applause, sharper than any speech. It told the world, we will not be trapped by sweet words. We will not surrender our independence for business deals disguised as friendship. The reaction inside Burkina Faso was electric. Farmers in the countryside who had just begun harvesting with new equipment felt a surge of pride. Mothers in the markets whispered that their leader had protected them from exploitation. Youth on the streets of Ouagadougou shared clips and commentary online, calling it the strongest silence in Africa. To them, this was not rudeness, it was resistance. It was proof that their nation could stand tall against the kind of flattery that had seduced and shackled African leaders for decades. International observers, however, were divided. Western media outlets framed the refusal as a snub that risked isolating Burkina Faso further. Analysts speculated that by refusing the U.S., Traoré was pushing his country deeper into the arms of Russia, already a visible partner in security and military cooperation. Some painted it as recklessness, an unnecessary gamble with the country's future. But within Africa, voices told a different story. Commentators in Mali and Niger, both members of the Sahel alliance, praised Traoré for his courage. They argued that the visit had been designed not to help, but to probe, to learn the secrets of how Burkina Faso was succeeding despite isolation sanctions and limited resources. Refusing to meet was not arrogance, it was protection. Protection from the slow but certain penetration of foreign interests that had for centuries turned Africa's strengths into its weaknesses. And so the debate grew. Was this silence a tactical victory or a dangerous provocation? Was it a wise step towards sovereignty or a risky snub that could close doors to cooperation? Across dinner tables and on talk shows, Africans wrestled with these questions. And yet beneath the arguments, one truth resonated: Traoré had captured the world's attention without uttering a single word. For the United States, the refusal was a reminder that Africa is no longer the chessboard it once was. No longer can praise alone open doors. No longer can compliments pave the way for contracts. Instead, Washington found itself staring at a new kind of leader, one who understood the rules of the game and chose not to play by them. The climax of this episode is not just about one visit. It is about the new posture of an entire continent. A posture of resistance. A posture of dignity. A posture that says, we will talk but not at your command. We will cooperate but not at the cost of our independence. We will choose when, how, and with whom. The consequences of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's refusal reached far beyond the walls of Parliament. What seemed like a simple diplomatic maneuver rippled through society, reshaping both the civil and political landscape of Burkina Faso. Among ordinary citizens, the reaction was visceral. In villages where farmers had just begun harvesting abundant crops, the refusal was celebrated as a shield against exploitation. For years, these men and women had seen foreign aid programs arrive with lofty promises only to leave behind dependency and disappointment. Now they felt a new sense of dignity. If our leader can say no to America, then perhaps we can say no to anyone who seeks to cheat us, one farmer was quoted saying in the markets of Ouagadougou. That sentiment spread quickly. In Ouagadougou, young people filled social media with messages of pride. They compared Traoré's silence to a drumbeat, steady, powerful, impossible to ignore. To them, this was not the politics of fear, but the politics of strength. It gave voice to a generation raised in the shadow of coups and crises, now yearning for leaders who put principle before applause. Their pride was not blind loyalty, but the belief that at last someone was willing to protect their future from being sold off behind closed doors. Politically, the decision carried heavy implications. By delegating the meeting to Dr. Osman Bouma and the transitional parliament, Traoré reinforced the legitimacy of his government institutions. It was a clever balancing act, avoiding direct compromise with Washington, while still demonstrating that Burkina Faso was not shutting its doors to diplomacy. The parliament's role signaled that international engagement would continue, but only under the nation's chosen terms. For many observers, this bolstered the perception that the country's sovereignty was not just embodied in one man, but rooted in its institutions. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Critics within the opposition warned that rejecting direct contact with the U.S. could isolate Burkina Faso at a time when economic challenges remained daunting. Inflation, unemployment, and security threats were still very real. Could the nation afford to turn away a potential partner? These voices questioned whether pride might come at too high a cost. Yet their concerns were often drowned out by a rising tide of national confidence. Internationally, the refusal reverberated as well. For Western governments, it was a wake-up call. They had grown accustomed to African leaders, eager for recognition, grateful for aid, or desperate for investment. Traoré's silence shattered that expectation. Suddenly, a young leader in the heart of the Sahel was dictating the terms of engagement and doing so with broad popular support. It forced Washington, Brussels, and Paris to confront an uncomfortable truth: the language of conditional aid and veiled threats was losing its power. Meanwhile, within the Pan-African movement, the episode was hailed as a victory. Leaders and activists in Mali, Niger, and beyond pointed to Burkina Faso as proof that a new political culture was possible, one that rejected dependency, demanded respect, and insisted on equality in partnerships. The refusal to meet was interpreted not as isolation, but as alignment with a broader wave of African self-determination. In the end, the civil and political consequences of this moment can be summed up in a single word: empowerment. Citizens felt it. Parliament embodied it. The international community was forced to recognize it. And in that empowerment lay the seeds of something larger, a movement that could redefine Africa's place in the world. From the American perspective, the events in Burkina Faso were both puzzling and unsettling. Washington had expected a warm reception, a chance to highlight cooperation, to reassert influence in a region where its presence had been shrinking. Instead, the refusal became a stark reminder that U.S. prestige is no longer guaranteed. For decades, American delegations arrived in African capitals, assuming that handshakes and compliments would be enough to secure access. This time, the formula failed. Inside policy circles in Washington, the analysis was blunt. Some saw Traoré's silence as a pivot toward Moscow, a continuation of Burkina Faso's growing alignment with Russia in the security and defense arena. Others warned that it symbolized a broader collapse of Western credibility across the Sahel. If a young leader could reject U.S. outreach so openly and gain popular support for doing so, what would stop other African nations from following? To older Americans who lived through the Cold War, this might sound familiar. Once again, influence is contested not just with military bases and aid packages, but with ideas about sovereignty, dignity, and independence. Traoré's refusal reminded the world that the age of unilateral dominance is over. Africa, long treated as a chessboard, is now positioning itself as a player in its own right. European capitals also took notice. In Paris, the silence was interpreted as another humiliation following the expulsion of French forces and the closure of long-standing bases in Burkina Faso. In Brussels, the European Union debated whether to double down on engagement or accept that the Sahel alliance Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger was drifting permanently out of Western orbit. What unnerved them most was not just Traoré's silence, but the enthusiastic support it generated among his citizens. Public opinion, once shaped by foreign-funded media, now seemed firmly on the side of sovereignty. On the global stage, reactions were mixed. Russia unsurprisingly welcomed the move, portraying it as evidence that Western hegemony was crumbling. Chinese commentators pointed out that Africa's demand for equal partnerships echoed Beijing's long-standing rhetoric. Even nations in the global south, from Latin America to South Asia, saw in Traoré's decision a familiar struggle, the fight to engage with great powers without being swallowed by them. For Africa itself, the implications were profound. Leaders from across the continent observed closely, some with admiration, others with caution. Those who feared losing Western aid worried that such defiance could bring economic consequences, but many, especially within the Pan-African movement, saw it as a watershed moment. The refusal was not anti-Americanism, it was pro-sovereignty. It was not the closing of doors, it was the reframing of the conversation. And for the United States, the lesson was sobering. Africa is no longer satisfied with being praised. Compliments without respect ring hollow. Partnership without equality is just another form of control. If Washington wishes to remain relevant, it must confront this reality. It must recognize leaders like Ibrahim Traoré not as rebels to be tamed, but as voices of a new Africa, confident, assertive, and unwilling to bow. In the end, what does one moment of silence truly mean? For Burkina Faso, it meant drawing a line in the sand. For Africa, it meant sending a message that sovereignty is not a bargaining chip. And for the world, it was a warning that the days of easy influence are fading fast. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's refusal to meet the U.S. congressional delegation was more than a diplomatic maneuver. It was a statement carved into the history of Africa's awakening. By letting his parliament host the Americans while he remained absent, Traoré reminded both allies and adversaries that Burkina Faso negotiates on its own terms. No handshakes behind closed doors, no flattery strong enough to soften its stance. Silence became his shield, and with it his nation's dignity remained intact. But here lies the caution. History teaches us that great powers rarely accept rejection gracefully. Aid may come with new strings, pressure may shift into subtler forms, narratives may emerge portraying leaders like Traoré as dangerous or unstable. Already, voices in Western media frame his silence as arrogance rather than strength. The struggle for sovereignty is never without consequence. And yet this is the very struggle that defines nations. For Africa, the broader lesson is clear: independence must be guarded daily, not just from overt threats, but from soft words, tempting offers, and glittering promises. For the United States and Europe, the message is equally clear. If they wish to build genuine partnerships, they must abandon the old habits of control. Equality is not optional. It is the foundation of any future engagement. And for us as observers, whether in America, Africa, or elsewhere, the question is unavoidable. Do we admire the courage to say no, or do we fear the costs it might bring? Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's refusal was a wise stand for sovereignty or a missed opportunity for cooperation? If you feel that dignity should never be for sale, then share this story with others. If you believe that Africa deserves leaders who choose principle over pressure, then let your voice be heard in the comments. And if you want to keep uncovering truths hidden behind headlines, subscribe to this channel, because the story of Africa's rise has only just begun. Please share if you feel proud to see a continent standing tall. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than theater and sovereignty matters more than applause.